I walked into the house at 11:47 p.m. and no one looked up. The television played in the living room where my sister Lily sat curled against our father's arm, laughing at something bright and meaningless. The sound of her laughter was crystalline, effortless, the kind that drew people in like moths to flame. My mother moved through the kitchen with her phone pressed to her ear, discussing Lily's upcoming gallery opening with the kind of animated pride that made my chest feel hollow. Her voice carried that particular pitch it always took when she talked about Lily, elevated and enthusiastic, as if she were describing something miraculous rather than ordinary. I stood in the doorway with my hospital discharge papers folded in my coat pocket, the IV bruise still fresh on the back of my hand. The bruise was purple-black at its centre, spreading out into yellows and greens at the edges like a watercolour painting of damage. It throbbed faintly with my heartbeat, a steady reminder that my body had been crying for help in ways my voice never could. "I'm home," I said. The words came out softer than I intended, but not so soft that they couldn't have been heard. My mother glanced up, nodded, and returned to her conversation without breaking stride. My father raised a hand without shifting his gaze from the screen, a gesture so automatic it might have been muscle memory rather than acknowledgement. Lily didn't even turn her head. She remained tucked against our father's side, secure in the knowledge that she was exactly where she belonged. I climbed the stairs to my room, each step feeling heavier than the last. My legs trembled slightly, residual weakness from 3 days in the hospital where I'd been hooked up to IV fluids and vitamin supplements while doctors asked careful questions about my home life. The stairs creaked under my weight, familiar sounds in a house that should have felt like home, but had always felt more like a stage where I'd forgotten my lines. The doctors had used words like severe dehydration and malnutrition and warning signs. They'd asked if anyone at home had noticed. I'd said yes because it felt easier than explaining that being invisible wasn't the same as being unseen. The truth was more complicated, more shameful somehow. They had seen me every day. They had looked directly at me across dinner tables and in hallways, but seeing and noticing were different things, and I had learned the distinction early. I closed my bedroom door and sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the wall where I once hung my debate team certificates. My mother had taken them down when Lily needed space to store her art supplies. The nails were still there, small empty holes that somehow felt like an accurate representation of my place in this family. 7 holes arranged in a pattern I'd chosen carefully, trying to make my achievements look intentional, aesthetic, worthy of wall space. Now they were just puncture wounds in beige paint. My phone buzzed, a message from Daniel. "Can't make it tonight. Lily needs help setting up her exhibit." Daniel, my boyfriend of 3 years. The man I'd met in college, who'd promised me that I mattered, that my quiet nature was beautiful, that I didn't need to compete for space in the world. He'd said he loved how I listened, how I never demanded attention, how I was content to exist beside him rather than needing to be the centre of everything. At the time, I'd thought he was seeing something valuable in me. Now I understood he'd been describing a feature, not a person. He'd started spending more time with Lily 6 months ago. They had creative synergy, he said. She understood art, she understood passion, she understood how to take what she wanted and make it seem like the natural order of things. I understood numbers and silence, and how to fold myself small enough to fit into the corners of other people's lives. I understood how to make my needs so quiet they could be mistaken for contentment. I typed a response, then deleted it, then typed it again. I was in the hospital. The 3 dots appeared, then vanished, then appeared again. I watched them pulse, those 3 small indicators that someone was thinking, composing, considering. My heart rate increased slightly, a foolish surge of hope that maybe this time would be different. Maybe this time the words, "I was in the hospital," would land with the weight they deserved. "Sorry, babe. Lily really needs me right now. We'll talk tomorrow." I set the phone face down on my nightstand and lay back against the pillows. The ceiling had a crack that ran from the light fixture to the far corner. I'd watched it grow for 2 years, a slow fracture that no one else seemed to notice. Sometimes I wondered if the crack was visible to anyone but me, or if I'd simply stared at the ceiling so long I'd created it through sheer focus, willing damage into existence to match the feeling in my chest. Tomorrow came, then the next day, then a week. I stopped sending messages. I stopped coming down for dinner. I stopped trying to insert myself into conversations that flowed around me like water around a stone, smooth and uninterrupted and utterly indifferent to my presence. The house developed a rhythm without me, and no one seemed to notice that I'd removed myself from it. The absence of someone who barely existed in the first place wasn't really absence at all. My mother knocked once, asked if I was feeling well, and left before I could answer. The knock was perfunctory, a ritual of care without the substance of it. She didn't wait long enough to hear my response, which told me she hadn't really been asking. She'd been checking a box, fulfilling the minimum requirement of maternal concern. My father slipped an envelope under my door with money for food, his version of care without confrontation. The envelope was thick, probably more money than I needed, as if quantity could substitute for quality of attention. I left it on my desk unopened for 3 days before finally putting it in my wallet. The money felt like payment for my silence, for my continued cooperation in my own erasure. Lily texted, "Can you pick up my dry cleaning? I'm too busy." I did it. I always did it. I drove across town to the expensive cleaner she preferred, the one that specialised in delicate fabrics and designer labels. I waited while they found her order. 3 silk blouses and a dress that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. I paid with the money my father had slipped under my door, completing the circuit of transaction that defined our family dynamic. Daniel called on a Thursday evening, his voice warm and familiar and utterly oblivious. "Hey, so I've been thinking. Lily's exhibit is in 2 days and it would mean a lot to her if you came. She's nervous, you know. She could use the support." The casualness of his tone struck me as remarkable. He was calling to ask me to support my sister and her exhibit, to show up for an event that would celebrate her work while I remained in the margins. He was calling as if the past week hadn't happened, as if I hadn't told him I'd been hospitalised, as if my silence had been agreement rather than surrender. "What about me?" I heard myself say. The words surprised me. They came from somewhere deeper than my usual careful consideration, bypassing the filter that normally caught anything that sounded like a demand or a need. "What?" "I could use support too." There was a pause, the kind that felt like the space before an excuse. I could hear him thinking, could almost see him mentally shuffling through responses, looking for the one that would minimize conflict while changing nothing. "Sienna, come on. Don't make this difficult. You know Lily's going through a lot right now. This exhibit is everything to her." "And what am I going through?" I wanted to ask. "What does it take for my struggles to rise to the level of mattering?" But I knew the answer. Lily's struggles were visible, dramatic, worthy of attention because she knew how to frame them as crises. Mine were quiet, internal, easy to overlook because I'd never learned how to make pain loud enough to demand recognition. "I was in the hospital," I said again, testing the words, seeing if they could create a different outcome this time. "I know, and I'm sorry I couldn't be there. But you're fine now, right? You're always fine." Always fine, always quiet, always there, always fading, always insufficient in ways I couldn't name or fix. The phrase, "you're always fine," should have been a compliment, a recognition of my strength. Instead, it was an indictment, evidence that I'd performed resilience so convincingly that no one believed I could genuinely need help. "I'll be at the exhibit," I said. "Great. Lily will be so happy. Love you." He hung up before I could respond. The speed of his disconnect felt telling, as if he'd been worried I might change my mind or ask for something he wasn't prepared to give. The "love you" was reflexive, meaningless. the kind of phrase that filled space without conveying emotion. I sat with my phone in my hand, the screen going dark, then lighting up again with a notification. A group chat I hadn't been removed from but never participated in. Someone had shared a photo of Lily and Daniel at some rooftop bar, her head thrown back in laughter, his arm around her shoulders. The golden hour light made them both look luminous, beautiful, like people who existed in a different reality than mine. They looked like they belonged together, like they occupied the same level of visibility and importance. The caption read, "Power, couple energy." 37 people had liked it. I scrolled up through the comments, each one a variation of praise and admiration. "So cute. You two are perfect together. Relationship goals." No one seemed to remember that Daniel was supposed to be my boyfriend. Or maybe they did remember and simply didn't care, because Lily's claim to anything had always superseded mine. I felt something crack inside me, but it was quiet, like the sound of ice forming on a winter lake. No one heard it. No one would. The crack was deep and fundamental, the kind of fracture that changes the entire structure of something. But it happened in silence, invisible to everyone but me, which felt appropriate. Even my breaking had to be done quietly. The night before the exhibit, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed watching the shadows shift across my ceiling, thinking about all the times I'd made myself smaller, all the words I'd swallowed, all the needs I'd compressed into silence because wanting felt like asking for too much. I thought about being 5 years old and learning not to interrupt when Lily was speaking, about being 10 and accepting that my science fair project wouldn't be displayed in the living room because Lily's painting was already there, about being 16 and watching my parents attend every one of Lily's art shows while missing my debate championships because they conflicted with her schedule. I thought about how my family had taught me that love was conditional on not needing anything, how Daniel had loved the idea of a low-maintenance girlfriend until low maintenance became invisible, how Lily had learned that taking up space meant taking mine, and how no one had ever corrected that understanding. The patterns had been established so early that they felt like natural law rather than learned behaviour. At 3 a.m, I got up and opened my laptop. I drafted an email to my boss, declining the promotion I'd been offered. The role required relocation to a different city, and I'd been planning to discuss it with Daniel to see if he'd come with me, if we'd build something together. The promotion was significant, a recognition of work I'd done well, a chance to lead my own team, but it felt impossible to accept without Daniel's support, without some indication that I was worth following. But I knew now what he'd say. He'd tell me to consider Lily's feelings. He'd remind me that family comes first. He'd make it sound reasonable, the way he always did, until I forgot that my dreams were supposed to matter too. He'd probably suggest I wait a year, just until Lily was more established, just until things settled down, just until some future moment that would never actually arrive. I deleted the draft. Then I wrote a new one. This one accepted the position. My hands trembled slightly as I typed. The words felt dangerous, revolutionary, like I was claiming something I had no right to want. But I typed them anyway, each sentence an act of quiet rebellion. I detailed my acceptance, my start date preference, my need for relocation assistance. I made myself real on the page in a way I'd never been real in my family's house. I closed the laptop and went back to bed. My heart felt strange, lighter and heavier at once, like I was carrying something precious toward a cliff edge. Sleep didn't come, but I didn't mind. I lay in the darkness, feeling the weight of my decision settle over me, knowing I'd crossed some invisible threshold from which there was no return. The exhibit opened at 7. I arrived at 6:45 wearing the black dress I'd saved for job interviews, my hair pulled back in a way that made me look older, more defined. The dress was simple, elegant, expensive in a way that suggested competence rather than trying too hard. I'd bought it with my own money, saved from paychecks I'd earned through work my family had never asked about. I looked at myself in the rearview mirror before getting out of the car and barely recognised the woman looking back. She looked composed, self-possessed, like someone who existed rather than someone who apologised for existing. The gallery was already crowded. I recognised people from family dinners, from Lily's social media, from the edges of my own life where I'd existed as context rather than content. They moved through the space with wine glasses and confident voices, admiring art and each other with equal enthusiasm. The gallery was the kind of trendy downtown space that charged high rent and attracted people who wanted to be seen appreciating culture. I found Lily in the centre of the main room, radiant in a red silk dress that caught the light every time she moved. The dress was dramatic, bold, exactly the kind of thing Lily wore well. Her hair fell in perfect waves down her back and her makeup was flawless. She looked like someone important, someone whose existence justified attention. Daniel stood beside her, his hand resting on her lower back in a gesture I recognised, one he used to reserve for me. The possessiveness of it struck me now in a way it never had before. His hand on her back was a claim, a public declaration of allegiance. My mother and father flanked them like proud sentries. My mother's hand on Lily's shoulder, my father beaming with an expression I'd never seen him direct at me. They looked complete, the four of them, like a family portrait that had never had space for me. I wondered if they'd noticed my absence from the frame, or if they'd simply adjusted unconsciously, the way people do when removing an unwanted object from a photograph. I watched them from the doorway. I watched the way they leaned into each other, a complete unit, a family that functioned perfectly well without me. The realization didn't hurt the way I expected. Instead, it clarified something, made obvious what had always been true but never acknowledged. Lily saw me first. Her smile flickered, surprise crossing her face, like I was a ghost she hadn't expected to materialize. "Sienna, you came!" Everyone turned. My mother's expression shifted into something performative, the mask of maternal affection she wore in public. Her eyes didn't quite match her smile, a disconnect I'd learned to read early. "Darling, we weren't sure you'd make it." "I said I would," I replied, my voice steady and quiet in mine. The steadiness surprised me. My voice didn't shake or apologize. It simply stated fact, flat and undeniable. I felt the power of it, the way certainty could be its own kind of strength. Daniel moved toward me, reaching for a hug I didn't return. His arms opened, but I remained still, not stepping back, but not leaning in, forcing him to abort the gesture awkwardly. "You look great. Are you feeling better?" "I'm fine," I said. "I'm always fine." He didn't catch the edge in my tone. He never did. The irony was almost beautiful in its completeness. I could stand here speaking truth wrapped in familiar phrases, and he would hear only what he expected, only what was convenient. Lily hooked her arm through mine, pulling me deeper into the gallery. Her touch was casual, proprietary, the way it had always been. She'd been holding on to me like this since we were children, a gesture that looked affectionate but functioned as control. "Come see my favourite piece. I think you'll appreciate it." We stopped in front of a large canvas, abstract shapes in muted greys and blues that suggested isolation, disconnection. The painting was technically skilled, I could see that. Lily had talent, real talent. But the subject matter made something cold unfurl in my stomach. The placard beside it read, "Silence, oil on canvas, 24. "It's about you," Lily said, her voice soft, almost tender. "About how you've always been so self-contained, so mysterious. I wanted to capture that quality." I stared at the painting, at the way she'd romanticized my erasure, at how she'd taken even my pain and made it beautiful, made it hers, made it something people would pay money to own. The shapes in the painting were isolated from each other, existing in separate spaces, with no connection, no bridge between them. It was accurate in a way that felt like violation. She'd seen my loneliness and found it aesthetically interesting. "It's lovely," I said. The words came out perfectly neutral. I gave her nothing. No reaction to feed on, no emotion to validate her interpretation of my life as her artistic material. She squeezed my arm. "I knew you'd understand. You always understand." The statement was so absurd it almost made me laugh. Understanding and accepting weren't the same thing, but Lily had never learnt the difference. To her, my silence had always meant agreement. My lack of protest had always meant consent. She'd built her entire understanding of me on that fundamental misinterpretation. The evening continued around me. People circulated, admiring Lily's work, praising her vision. They used words like profound and evocative and deeply moving. They saw art where I saw evidence, beauty where I saw theft. I stood to the side, a familiar position, and felt something inside me settle into perfect, crystalline clarity. I wasn't angry. I wasn't hurt. I was simply done. The realization was calm, absolute. It didn't arrive with fanfare or emotional drama. It simply existed, complete and undeniable. I was done performing a role in a family that would never see me as more than supporting cast. I was done shrinking myself to make space for people who would expand to fill whatever space I surrendered. I was done waiting for recognition that would never come because I'd finally understood that the problem wasn't my invisibility. The problem was that they preferred me that way. At 9 o'clock, I slipped away without saying goodbye. No one noticed. I drove home through streets that felt different, like I was seeing them for the first time, or the last. The city looked strange under streetlights, familiar geography rendered foreign by my shifting internal landscape. I parked in the driveway and sat for a moment, looking at the house where I'd spent 26 years learning how to disappear. The lights were off in my room, the window dark like an empty eye socket. Then I went inside, climbed the stairs to my room, and began to pack. My phone buzzed throughout the night, messages from my mother asking where I'd gone. From Lily, saying I'd embarrassed her by leaving early. From Daniel, saying we needed to talk. Each notification was a tiny demand, an expectation that I would explain myself, justify my departure, apologize for existing wrong. I didn't respond to any of them. The silence of my non-response felt powerful. Each buzz of my phone was a question I refused to answer, a hook I refused to take. I turned the phone face down and continued folding clothes, organizing my life into portable pieces. At 2 a.m., I finished packing. 2 suitcases, 1 box. Everything else could stay. Material objects felt less important than the weight I was shedding, the expectation that I would always bend, always accommodate, always fade. The room looked strange with my belongings removed, emptier but somehow more honest. Without my things, it was just a room, neutral and impersonal. It had never really been mine anyway. I sat on my bed and pulled out my phone. I typed a single message to the family group chat. "I'm leaving. Don't look for me." The words were simple, direct, without explanation or justification. I didn't owe them more than that. Then I blocked all of them. The blocking was methodical, satisfying. My mother, my father, Lily, Daniel, each one removed with a simple swipe and tap. Their access to me deleted, their ability to demand anything severed. My phone felt lighter after, as if I'd removed actual weight rather than just digital connections. I carried my things to my car in the darkness. The house stayed silent behind me. No one woke, no one called out. I was leaving the same way I'd lived, in silence, but this time the silence was mine. I loaded the trunk carefully, arranging my suitcases and box with deliberate precision. Then I sat in the driver's seat and started the engine. I didn't look back at the house. I simply pulled out of the driveway and drove until the familiar streets gave way to highway, until the city lights faded behind me. I drove until the sun came up until the city disappeared behind me and the landscape opened into something vast and unfamiliar. The sunrise was spectacular, bands of pink and gold spreading across the horizon like a promise. I stopped at a rest area and checked my email. The acceptance letter for my new position was there, along with details about my start date and relocation assistance. Reading it felt surreal, like I was looking at someone else's life, someone who made bold choices and believed she deserved good things. I started the car again and kept driving. The town where my new job was located sat at the base of mountains, small and clean and full of strangers who didn't know me as the quiet one, the invisible one, the sister who existed to highlight someone else's brilliance. The air felt different here, cleaner somehow, like it carried less history. I breathed it in deeply, filling my lungs with possibility. I found an apartment, signed a lease, and moved in within a week. The apartment was small but bright, with large windows that let in light without judgment. I furnished it slowly, carefully, choosing each piece for myself rather than accepting hand-me-downs or considering what anyone else might think. A blue couch because I liked blue. A bookshelf that I filled with books I wanted to read. Not books that would impress visitors. Plants that needed tending, living things that would respond to my care with visible growth. I started work on Monday. My colleagues were kind, curious, engaged. They asked questions and waited for answers. They noticed when I contributed ideas. They made space for me without me having to carve it out first. In meetings, when I spoke, people turned to listen. My opinions were considered, debated, sometimes implemented. I learned that my voice had value, that silence was only powerful when it was a choice rather than a condition. 3 months passed, then 6. I changed. Not into someone loud or aggressive or dramatically different. I simply became myself without apologizing for it, without compressing my needs into something small enough to fit beside someone else's wants. I learned to state preferences, to say no without extensive justification, to exist at full volume instead of on mute. I made friends, real friends, who called to check in, who remembered details about my life, who invited me to things because they wanted my company rather than needing my function. I dated carefully, learning to recognize the difference between someone who appreciated my calm nature and someone who saw it as permission to ignore me. I went on dates that went nowhere, and a few that went somewhere interesting. I learned what I wanted, what I wouldn't tolerate, what made me feel seen versus what made me feel useful. I thrived in ways I hadn't known were possible. My body changed too. I gained weight, healthy weight, from regular meals and lack of stress. Colour returned to my face. The shadows under my eyes faded. I looked in mirrors and recognised the person looking back, which felt like a minor miracle. Back home, the silence I'd left behind began to speak. My mother called my old number repeatedly. When she realised it was disconnected, she emailed. Then she sent letters to my old apartment, which were returned as undeliverable. Each returned letter was a small violence, evidence that I'd removed myself so completely that even physical mail couldn't reach me. I learned about these attempts through the building manager at my old place, who mentioned them when I went back to retrieve a security deposit. Lily posted on social media vague messages about missing someone, about taking people for granted. Her engagement started to drop. People noticed that her muse had vanished, that her new work lacked the depth of pieces, like silence. The comments under her posts shifted from enthusiastic praise to concerned questions. Are you okay? Where's your sister? I miss your old style. Daniel showed up at my old apartment 6 months after I left. The new tenant told him I'd moved away, left no forwarding address. He waited outside for 3 hours, then drove to my parents' house. They had nothing to tell him. According to my old neighbour, who I'd maintained sporadic contact with, he looked devastated. lost, like someone who'd misplaced something valuable and only just realised it was gone. He started calling mutual friends, asking if anyone had heard from me. No one had. I'd severed every connection, every tether that bound me to a life where I'd been scenery rather than subject. I'd been methodical about it, blocking people on social media, changing my email, getting a new phone number. I'd made myself unfindable, which took effort but felt necessary. 8 months after I left, my mother hired a private investigator. He found my new city, but couldn't locate me specifically. Privacy laws protected me in ways my family never had. According to the investigator's report, which my mother apparently shared with Lily, who mentioned it in a social media post I saw through a mutual acquaintance, he could confirm I was alive and employed, but couldn't provide any contact information without my consent. My mother had cried when she received this information, the post said, relieved I was alive but devastated by the distance I'd created. My father sent an email to my old work address, which forwarded to my personal account. I read it once. Sienna, please come home. We need to talk. We miss you. The email was longer than that, actually. 2 pages of carefully worded regret, explanations of how they hadn't realised, how they had taken me for granted, how the house felt empty without me. He wrote about sitting in my old room, about finding the nail holes where my certificates had hung, about understanding too late what those empty spaces represented. I archived it without responding. The response I didn't send lived in my drafts folder for a week before I deleted it. It would have said, "You miss what I did for you, not who I am. There's a difference." But even that felt like too much engagement, too much education of people who should have learnt these lessons decades ago. A year passed. Lily's second exhibit received lukewarm reviews. Critics noted that her work had lost something, some ineffable quality that made the previous collection compelling. One review specifically mentioned that her new paintings felt technically proficient but emotionally hollow, as if the artist is reaching for depth she no longer has access to. She tried to recreate silence, produced 3 different versions, each more desperate and hollow than the last. None of them sold. Daniel broke things off with her after she became obsessive about finding me, about understanding where I'd gone and why. He told mutual friends he felt guilty, that he should have noticed I was struggling, that he'd taken my steadiness for granted. The guilt apparently made him poor company, unable to be present in a new relationship because he was haunted by the old one. According to the gossip I heard third hand, he'd told someone that he'd lost the best thing in his life and hadn't even noticed until it was gone. My mother developed anxiety, startling at unexpected noises, checking her phone compulsively for messages that never came. My father became withdrawn, spending evenings in my old room, sitting on the stripped bed, staring at the nail holes in the wall. These details reached me through my old neighbour, who remained friendly and kept me updated without judgment. She said the house looked different, darker somehow, like something essential had been removed. They finally understood the weight of my absence. They finally heard my silence. I learned about all of this through careful internet searches, through social media posts from people who didn't know I was watching. I felt nothing sharp or satisfying, just a quiet sense of completion, like solving an equation that had been unbalanced for too long. Their suffering didn't please me, but neither did it move me to return. They were learning lessons they should have learned differently, but learning nonetheless. One afternoon, 15 months after I left, I was sitting in a coffee shop reading when someone sat down across from me. Lily. She looked different, thinner, tired. Her hair was pulled back carelessly, and her clothes were rumpled in a way that suggested she'd been travelling. The red silk dress and perfect makeup were gone, replaced by jeans and a sweatshirt, bare face, dark circles under eyes that looked like they'd cried themselves empty. She looked diminished, smaller somehow, like she'd lost the light that made her magnetic. "I found you," she said. Her voice was hoarse, uncertain. The confidence that had always characterized her was gone. I closed my book and met her gaze. I didn't want to be found. I know. She twisted her hands together on the table between us. Sienna, I need to talk to you. You have 5 minutes. The boundary felt good to set, clean and clear. 5 minutes. Not unlimited access, not whatever she needed, not the blank check I'd always offered before. She flinched at the flatness in my voice, then nodded. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. I didn't see how much I was taking from you, how much we all were. You're right. You didn't see. I see now. We all do. The house is so quiet without you. Mom barely speaks. Dad sits in your room every night, and Her voice cracked. I lost my inspiration. I can't create anything meaningful. Everything feels hollow. I took a sip of my coffee, letting her words settle in the space between us. The coffee was good, rich and dark, from a local roaster I'd discovered. Small pleasures I'd learned to notice and claim. That's not my responsibility. I know. I'm not asking you to come back. I'm just asking you to understand that we miss you, that we finally understand what we lost. What you lost, I corrected gently. I found myself. The distinction was important. They'd lost a support system, a facilitator, a person who made their lives easier. I'd found autonomy, peace, self-worth. The transaction wasn't equivalent. She wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. Can we have a relationship, even a small one? I want to know you. The real you, not the version I created in my head. I studied her face, looking for manipulation or performance, but saw only genuine devastation. Her pain was real, earned through consequences she'd never expected to face. It didn't change anything, but it confirmed what I'd hoped. The absence could teach what presence couldn't. Maybe someday, I said, but not now. Right now, I need to keep building a life where I'm not supporting everyone else's dreams at the expense of my own. I understand. She stood, hesitated. For what? It's worth. Your silence was never something to fix. It was beautiful. I just wish I'd listened to it instead of trying to interpret it. She left before I could respond. I sat in the coffee shop for another hour, watching people come and go, feeling the solid weight of my own company. I felt sad for what my family had lost, but I didn't feel responsible for returning to fix it. Sadness and obligation were different things, and I'd learned to separate them. Their regret was karmic, not constructive. They missed what I'd provided, not who I was. The distinction mattered. That evening, I went home to my apartment, made dinner, and called a friend I'd made at work. We talked about a book club meeting, about a hiking trip we were planning, about ordinary things that felt extraordinary, because they included me as a participant rather than an observer. My friend laughed at something I said, a genuine laugh that acknowledged my humour rather than filling awkward space. These small moments of recognition had become precious to me. After the call, I stood on my balcony looking out at mountains I was learning to name. The air was cool and clean. The silence around me felt different from the silence I'd known before. Fuller, somehow, like it was mine to fill or keep as I chose. Birds called to each other in the trees. Somewhere down the street, children played. The world was full of sound, but the silence I carried was internal, chosen, powerful. I thought about Lily sitting across from me, about the desperation in her eyes when she'd realised that some things once broken can't be reassembled into their original form. I thought about Daniel, who'd loved my quietness until it became inconvenience, who'd probably convinced himself he was blameless because I'd never complained loudly enough. I thought about my parents, who'd distributed their love unevenly and were learning that neglect compounds silently until the day it declares itself through absence. I didn't wish them harm. I simply wished them understanding. 2 years passed. I was promoted at work. I published a research paper that gained attention in my field. I fell in love with someone who asked questions and waited for answers, who understood that stillness wasn't emptiness. Their name was Alex, and they had a quiet laugh and steady hands and a way of looking at me that suggested they saw all of me, not just the convenient parts. We moved slowly, carefully, building something that felt balanced rather than lopsided. My apartment filled with things I chose, plants that required tending, art that reflected my taste, books I read because they interested me rather than because someone else thought I should. I painted the walls a warm grey blue that reminded me of early morning sky. I hung curtains I'd picked out myself. I created space that felt like mine in a way my childhood bedroom never had. I built a life that felt like mine. Occasionally, I still received emails from my mother. They evolved from desperate to resigned to thoughtful. She started including updates about her own life rather than just begging for mine. She told me she'd started therapy, that she was learning about her own patterns, her own failures, that she'd realised she'd repeated dynamics from her own childhood, favouring the child who demanded more because that's what her parents had done. She was learning, she said, but she understood it was too late to undo the damage. I read them, but didn't respond. Reading them was enough. I allowed myself that connection without requiring myself to reciprocate. My father sent a package on my birthday, a photo album he'd made full of pictures I'd never seen. Me at various ages, always at the edges of frame, always slightly out of focus. Me behind Lily at birthday parties, beside her at graduations, in the background of family portraits. Evidence of my presence that somehow emphasised my absence. On the last page, he'd written, "I'm sorry I didn't see you. I see you now." I kept the album, but didn't acknowledge it. The album lived on my bookshelf, a record of what had been. Sometimes I looked through it, studying the child I'd been, feeling compassion for her rather than anger. Lily stopped trying to contact me directly. Instead, she created a new series of paintings called The Sound of Silence. The reviews were better than her previous work, noting a new maturity, a deeper understanding of absence and presence. She donated all proceeds to a mental health charity focused on family dynamics and childhood neglect. It was growth, but it was hers to experience alone. I saw photos of the exhibit online. The paintings were good, genuinely good, deeper than her earlier work. She'd learned something through loss, through consequence. But her growth didn't require my presence or participation. 3 years after I left, I returned to my old city for a conference. I walked past the house where I grew up, past the gallery where Lily had displayed her work, past the coffee shop where Daniel and I used to meet. The city felt like a museum of my former life, interesting, but no longer mine. I could observe it without being pulled into it. I felt nothing sharp or unfinished, just a quiet acknowledgement that this place had been part of my story but was no longer my home. On my last evening, I agreed to meet my mother for dinner. Just dinner, I'd specified in my email. No ambushes, no family gatherings, no expectations of reconciliation. She'd responded immediately, gratefully, accepting any terms I set. She arrived early, already seated when I walked in. She'd aged in the 3 years since I'd seen her, new lines around her eyes and mouth that spoke of worry and sleepless nights. Her hair had gone greyer. She looked smaller somehow, diminished, like guilt had physical weight and she'd been carrying it constantly. "Sienna," she said, standing. She started to reach for a hug, then stopped herself. "Thank you for coming." Sure, restraint suggested she'd learnt something about respecting boundaries. I appreciated it. I sat across from her. "How are you?" "Struggling," she said, honestly. "Learning. Trying to understand how I failed you so completely. You prioritized one daughter over the other, consistently, from childhood through adulthood. The directness felt good. No softening, no cushioning, just truth spoken plainly. She flinched but didn't argue. Yes, I did. I told myself that Lily needed more because she was more vocal about her needs. But the truth is, I took the easy path. I gave attention to whoever demanded it and ignored the child who didn't ask. I asked, I said quietly. You just couldn't hear me. The statement hung between us. It was true, and we both knew it. I had asked in small ways, in quiet ways, but asking quietly while someone else shouted had made my requests invisible. No, she agreed. I didn't want to hear you. It was easier to believe you were fine, that you were self-sufficient, that you didn't need me. We sat in silence for a moment. The restaurant hummed with other people's conversations, other families sharing meals that might be easy or difficult or somewhere in between. Life continuing around us in all its messy complexity. I'm not coming back, I said. Not to live with you, not to resume our old dynamic, not to help patch whatever broke when I left. I understand. I'm happy now. I'm building something that's mine. I won't sacrifice that, not for guilt or obligation or sentimentality. I wouldn't ask you to. She twisted her napkin in her hands, a nervous gesture I recognized from childhood. I just wanted to tell you that I'm proud of you. I know I never said it when it mattered, but I'm saying it now. You became exactly who you needed to be, with no help from any of us. I felt something shift in my chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but acknowledgement. She was trying. It was too late to repair what had been broken, but she was trying to own her part in the breaking. That meant something, even if it didn't change anything. Thank you. We ordered food. We talked carefully around the broken parts of our relationship, touching on safe topics. My work, her therapy, books we'd both read, neutral observations about the city and how it had changed. The conversation was stilted, but not hostile. We were two people learning to exist in the same space without one of them disappearing. It wasn't reconciliation. It was just two people learning to coexist with history between them. As we said goodbye, my mother touched my arm gently. I hope someday you'll let us be part of your life again. Even a small part, but I understand if you don't. Maybe someday, I echoed the words I'd said to Lily years before. But not yet. I flew home the next day. My partner picked me up from the airport, asking how the trip had gone. I told them about the conference, about the dinner, about walking past my old life and feeling nothing more than mild curiosity. They listened without judgment, understanding that some family relationships were complicated in ways that defied easy resolution. Do you think you'll ever go back? They asked. Not to stay, I said. Maybe to visit, maybe to let them see who I became without them. But my home is here now. We drove through the city I'd chosen, the one where I'd built a life from nothing, where I'd learned to exist without apologizing. The mountains rose in the distance, solid and permanent. I felt anchored here in a way I'd never felt before. That night, I stood on my balcony again, looking at the mountains that had become familiar. I thought about the girl I'd been, so desperate for recognition, that she'd erased herself trying to earn it. I thought about the woman I'd become who'd learned that the most powerful thing she could do was choose herself. The silence around me felt complete. Not empty, but full of my own presence, my own voice, my own life unfolding exactly as I wanted it to. They had said I was always too quiet. They'd meant it as criticism, as evidence of my insufficiency, as proof that I needed fixing, that I was lacking something essential. But after Rebirth, they'd learned what I'd always known, that silence could be a statement, a boundary, a choice, that absence could be more powerful than presence, that removing yourself from people who refuse to see you was self-preservation, not cruelty. They missed the sound of my silence because in its absence, they finally heard what they'd refused to listen to before. That I mattered. That I deserved space. That choosing myself over their comfort wasn't cruelty, it was survival. I stood on my balcony until the stars came out, feeling the weight of my own life settling around me like something earned, something chosen, something mine. The night air was cool against my skin. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. Normal sounds of a normal evening in a life I'd built with my own hands. The quiet felt like power. The silence felt like peace. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for anyone's permission to take up space. I was simply here, whole and complete, in a silence that finally belonged to me. A silence that was no longer about making myself small, but about claiming space for myself to grow. A silence that they finally understood as the language it had always been. A language of boundaries, of self-worth, of choosing life over slow disappearance. They had called me too quiet, but now they understood that my silence had been the loudest thing I ever said.